painting our textures within Photoshop. Alright, so we have the UVs for this inner portion of the eye. So let's go ahead and let's take this first layer, and we'll just double click on this so we can disable the background lock. And what we can now start to do is just maybe drop on some kind of a new layer. We'll basically take this and lock this down, so that way we can actually remember what this is. And what we'll do is just take this and just switch this to something like a multiply mode, which will basically make all these white areas become transparent. Alright, and then if we need to, we could always just come in and then start to lower the opacity. So now what this should give us the ability to do is come in and start to make some really nice adjustments and start to paint underneath this UV, and all the while just basically using this sort of as our guides. Alright, so let's get started with the actual iris portion. This is going to be probably the most time-consuming piece that we're going to be working on. So what I'll try to do is actually begin this really from the center of my document. Now in my case, this should be pretty easy because the middle part of this eye should actually correspond exactly to the middle of this document, right, because of the way that this was actually projected back in our 3D app. Alright, so let's get started with really just sort of this first portion. Now for the moment, I'm really not going to concern myself too greatly with the actual colors, because we'll probably have to come back and make a lot of adjustments to these colors anyway. So really what I want to try to do for the moment is just focus on the actual creation of this. So what I'm going to do is just switch to my round marquee, and what I'm actually doing is I'm pressing both the Alt and the Shift key on my keyboard. So the Alt key is to make sure that the radius gets drawn out from the center of wherever I click, and the Shift key is to make sure that this gets drawn out in a perfect circle. Right, so what I'll try to do is stop this outline right at the part where we had the little dimp in the inside of the eye. So if you recall back in our 3D app, this is the part that was actually responsible for sort of dipping in and creating that little bit of an indentation. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and draw this out, and I'll press Alt Backspace to go ahead and fill this with my foreground color. Control D to deselect. And there we go. Looks like this lines up pretty well. Now, one of the things that you'll probably notice really with just about any eye is the fact that it actually does not have just this really sharp edge around it. In fact, if you actually look at most people's eyes, you'll notice that it's actually a little bit softer. You have a little bit more of a gradual kind of soft transition between this part of the iris and the actual sclera of the eye, which is the white part. So what we're going to try to do is actually incorporate that into our texture as well, because all of these different things, these small little irregularities and these imperfections, are what is actually going to make this look much more realistic. Alright, so let's go ahead and select this layer. Let's go to Filter, Blur, and we'll just use a simple Gaussian blur. And in this case, looks like 10 pixels may be a little bit too much. Again, we don't want to introduce too much blur. In my case, something like 4 pixels should work relatively well. If we want to see what this looks like with some kind of an actual background, at the moment this gets a little bit difficult to see with the actual checkered background as well as the actual UVs. So I'll just fill this with something like white, so that way I can actually see what the blur looks like. It just visually makes this a lot easier to see. And I think for the moment this will probably work just fine. Although a lot of times I do sort of like to err on the side of caution. A lot of times if you find that this is still too sharp, it's always easy to come back in and add just a little bit of extra blur. But if you find at some point down the road that you've blurred it too much, then there's really not a whole lot that you can do to go back and unblur it. So usually I like to just kind of be on the safe side and usually try to get it to a point where I could always blur it a little bit more if I needed to. But for the moment I think this will work just fine. Alright, so once I have this in place, one of the first things I like to do is start to come in and add just a little bit of random noise and some variation on this. With the iris, the real point of this is going to try to create a lot of depth and the illusion of a lot of overlapping pieces. So as this course starts to progress, we'll start to add a lot of just little small layers onto this. But to begin with, we can really just start very, very rough. So if we were to come in and make a new adjustment layer, and if we were to actually use the effects, rather, let's add something like, oh, maybe just a simple pattern overlay. This is actually being cut off on your screen, but it's actually toward the bottom of this effects menu. There we go, and what this will actually do is allow us to put a whole bunch of different styles onto this particular layer that we have selected. Now in my case, I'm going to use a pattern overlay, and we can use one of these simple pre-built patterns that we can find within Photoshop. As far as what you want to use, it's really up to you. In my case, I'll maybe use something like this cloud layer. There we go, that'll work just fine. And you can see how that really quickly just adds a lot of noise and just some various patterns in here. Now, one of the things that you will notice is that we do now start to get kind of a nice little pattern in here. But at the moment, this has actually cost me my green color. So let's actually go back to this pattern overlay, and because this is just a simple black and white image, we can just switch this to something like a multiply mode. You can see that it will basically make all the white areas transparent, and just kind of gives us the ability to retain a little bit more of this color. Alright, now what I'll also do is try to incorporate a little bit of the darkening that you will typically start to see on the outer part of the eye. This is usually just a little bit darker ring that you'll see right around this area where the iris actually begins to come into contact with the sclera. So what I can do is just go back into Photoshop. We'll use something like an inner glow, which is a good one to use for something like this. And what this can actually give us the ability to do is have these glowing effects and things like that. But if we were to come in and switch this to black, in my case now you notice that this has disappeared, and because by default the blend mode is actually set to screen, which will essentially make any black areas transparent. So if I set this back to a normal mode, and then come in and begin adjusting this, now we can actually see the darkening that we can start to introduce here. Now in my case, I want to make this a little bit more subtle. So I'll just come in and start to drop this opacity down just very slightly, so that way it just creates a little bit more of a gradual ring. Again, subtlety is really going to be the key to this, so we really want to make this as subtle as possible and as realistic as possible, just using a whole bunch of different layers. Alright, so at the moment you can see that we have something that looks really, really rough and really looks nothing whatsoever like an eye. But what we'll start to do in some of these next few lessons is begin the process of starting to layer on some of these different iris strands, and you'll see very quickly how this can start to make this eye really pop visually.